All right. Hello everyone. So, um, hopefully you can hear me. Um, yeah. So, um, I take requests on Patreon for um blog posts or videos. It's that $10 tier. Um, if you like, you can um also, you know, um make a one-time $10 donation through the PayPal, which is also on my channel, and I'll also take a request for a video or a blog post. But so yeah, someone requested this um sort of older, pretty old by now, it was 10 years ago, video about requested me to respond to this video about anarcho-capitalism and anarcho-syndicalism that was made by this guy called Storm Clouds Gathering. He did a lot of like anti-government like content back in the day, and he sort of associated himself um, with um, the Oath Keepers militia. So we sort of saw what happened with them. Um, but yeah, he made this video on anarcho-capitalism and anarcho-syndicalism because back in the day, the thing that anarchists probably mostly did on the internet was argue with ANCAPs. Um, yeah, the person who made this request wanted me to respond to this video, so I'm gonna do that. Um, yeah. So let's get started.
Capitalism is a loaded term. Capitalism is a loaded term. It's a point of division between a number of political and philosophical schools of thought. And in that sense, it's a wedge issue, one of the key wedge issues in the current left right paradigm. One of the main reasons for this controversy comes from the fact that people don't agree on the meaning of the word. Many people believe that our current system is a capitalist system, and as such, they point to the results of our current system when they're building an argument against capitalism. Such people view capitalism as institutionalized greed, and they view greed as a definitively negative force in the world. Others will argue that our current system isn't really capitalism at all, but is in fact corporatism, and that the evils of our current situation should rather be attributed to the intervention of the state, particularly in regards to its role in establishing corporations, propping up monopolies, and interfering with the natural movement of goods and services.
So this is a way in which, I mean, I'll might be helpful here to tell you something about how the debates between anarchists and ANCAPs went on the internet back in the day. Um, so, you know, one of the sort of um, points that would often get brought up by ANCAPs is that, well, you know, what anarchists describe as capitalism really isn't capitalism because it's not a system. It's not a totally free market system. It's not a system with totally free enterprise, total non-government interference, etc. Right? And so it's really not capitalism. So really, what anarchists are opposed to is not, and I'm using anarchists to refer to, um, uh, you know, um, uh, libertarian socialists, right? I'm not, I never thought of another sort of broad, another sort of dispute that was often a semantic dispute was like, what counts as anarchism. Um, and I don't think anarcho-capitalism belongs in the same sort of political, philosophical bag as anarchism does. So I'm, using the word anarchism to refer to libertarian socialism. But anyway, putting that aside, so you know, the ANCAPs would make this point, like, well, what anarchists are opposed to isn't really capitalism because capitalism, by definition, is a system of total free enterprise, totally free markets, no government intervention whatsoever. Um, Now, you could a point was often made that, like, that's sort of just an idiosyncratic way of using the term that the ANCAPs had. Nobody else who wasn't a right-wing libertarian or who isn't a right-wing libertarian would have subscribed to that way of using the term. But in some ways, it became sort of a semantic dispute. A semantic dispute is a dispute that's not substantive. It's just a dispute over how you want to use a word. And I think that most of the time ended up distracting from an actual substantive dispute that sort of was papered over by the semantic dispute. And the substantive dispute is like the following, right? So the substantive dispute is over whether a mode of production premised on the endless accumulation of capital could be a really could provide a sort of free society through quote unquote free markets and free enterprise. And, whether that sort of way of doing that kind of organization of production that's characteristic of, the broader usage of the term capitalism, whether that could be, could facilitate a free society in that way. And, that I think was the really substantive dispute, because I think there's a very straightforward case to make that it can't. Anarchists often made that case. It was sort of part of classical anarchist writing to make that case. It's sort of always been part of socialist writing to make that case. And there's also, of course, a lot of heterodox economics and economic history to show that, to make that case. And of course, the ANCAPs had their own case to make to the contrary, where they sort of used their sort of neoliberal economic theory from people like Mises and Hayek and Milton Friedman, right? So that, I think, is the actual substantive dispute, that the semantic dispute about whether you can call something capitalism sort of papered over. But yeah.
Defenders of capitalism view capitalism as a positive force in the world and often argue that greed itself has gotten a bad rap. Now, obviously, there are more than two positions in this debate, but if we look at it objectively, most of the standard arguments fall somewhere in a spectrum, with a completely non-monetary economy and full communal ownership of property on the far left, and absolute free markets and private ownership on the far right. This debate is always muddled by an unspoken variable: use of violent enforcement, whether that enforcement comes from an official state entity or merely the will of the collective. For the sake of clarity, we're going to analyze this spectrum with violent enforcement completely removed from the equation, and we're going to assume that both sides have agreed to abide by the non-aggression principle.
Okay, so that sort of already begs the question against the case that socialists make against capitalism, right? The case that socialists make against capitalism is that capitalism, and this is what I was sort of reverting to earlier, capitalism requires hierarchical domination. It requires coercive economic and political mechanisms, even coercive cultural mechanisms. And so saying, okay, let's just evaluate this, assuming that, we could in principle separate that kind of coercion from capitalism, right, is just going to beg the question against the case that the socialist has to make, right? So, I think that's a pretty bad way of going about it. Yeah.
If you remove violent enforcement of ideologies, then what you have on the far left is what we would call anarcho-syndicalism, tribalism, or anarcho-primitivism.
Okay, so I'm not sure why he uses those terms interchangeably, it seems. Anarcho-syndicalism is not tribalism. It's not anarcho-primitivism. Anarcho-syndicalism isn't even synonymous with like libertarian socialism or libertarian communism. So there's a broader category, libertarian socialism or libertarian communism, which is a sort of branch of socialist political philosophy that argues that the achievement of socialism or communism requires the complete abolition of all, immediate complete abolition of all sort of hierarchical structures of domination. Um, and then anarcho-syndicalism is a subset of that category, right? So anarcho-syndicalism, adheres to that principle I just described, and it also makes the further claim that the way one should go about immediately abolishing all hierarchical structures of domination and achieving communism or socialism is through the organization of self-governing, self-managing revolutionary labor unions. It has nothing to do with primitivism or tribalism or any of that stuff. I don't know why he's tacking that on there, but yeah. Anyway.
On the right, you would have anarcho-capitalism or free market capitalism. The word capitalism to an anarcho-capitalist simply refers to the voluntary exchange of goods and services. To an anarcho-capitalist, it is assumed that such exchanges are inherently beneficial to both parties, otherwise they would not take place. And they believe that the market itself is the best arbitrator of what works and what doesn't work within a society. Anarcho-capitalists view profit motive as a positive force because it encourages innovation and leads to greater efficiency and therefore better and cheaper products for everyone. Anarcho-capitalists believe that everything should be privately owned, though in some cases groups of individuals could theoretically share ownership of large infrastructure as needed. There is, however, a great deal of skepticism in this regard. From within this perspective, money is considered to be a natural and inevitable result, since it greatly increases the efficiency of commercial exchanges. However, in an anarcho-capitalist system, no currency would have a state-backed monopoly. To those coming from an anarcho.
Okay, so and that sort of gets at the heart of this substantive dispute that I think could be had, which he just sort of begs the question against, which is like, okay, if we're assuming that what the ANCAPs mean by capitalism includes things like the market and profit, right? There's just a straightforward case, right, to be made that those things require systematic coercion, right? Those things require violent enforcement, as he says, right? So, and there's a lot to be said on that front, but let's just take the market as a profit-making mechanism, okay? So, the market as a profit-making mechanism, right, requires that producers, right, be able to set prices for their goods, right, that are, relatively well above the cost of production of those goods, right? Now, if the market is a free market in the sense that there just is no sort of monopolization of productive resources, no coercive political institutions interfering, right? Then there's nothing stopping, right, the consumers in the market bidding down the producers' prices to zero, right? So, it's basic sort of market logic middle schooler can understand. you know um this guy asks for X price for Y good, but this guy asks for Z price for Y good, and Z price is much lower than X price. So given that, my options as a consumer aren't limited by political mechanisms, concentrated economic power, etc., right? I'm going to go with Z for Y, right? And I'm not going to go with the more expensive option, right? And given that in this so-called free market, there are no sort of coercive monopolistic mechanisms that would interfere with consumers bidding down prices in this way, prices would just be bid down to zero. You wouldn't be able to make any profit as a producer, right? So in order to prevent that, in order to make the market a serious profit-making mechanism, what you have to do is you have to have what are called semi or quasi monopolies. Because of competition, market competition, which does exist, right? It's real. Um, it's actually relatively hard to sustain a full-fledged monopoly, right? But what you can sustain is a quasi or semi monopoly where you have some relative exclusive control over some process of production, a leading process of production, meaning a profitable one, for some period of time, right? And that control eventually liquidates because of competition, right? Um, and so those semi monopolies, and they eventually liquidate because of competition, right? Um, it's for some period of time that these quasi monopolies last, right? Usually like 25 to 30 years. Um, anyway, so the those quasi monopolies are backed up by coercive political mechanisms, right? Such as the state, such as intellectual property, um, uh, such as corruption, et cetera, right? All the familiar coercive political mechanisms that, anarcho-capitalists would call corporatism, right? War is even one way of, semi monopolies being established and, competing and so forth and so on. So that's just one way, and there are many myriad of other ways to show that, you know, basic mechanisms of capitalism, as ANCAPs refer to it, aren't conducive to this sort of free market, voluntary society vision of what um, an economy premised on profit making in the market could be like, according to anarcho-capitalists. But anyway, let's see what he has to say about anarcho-syndicalism.
Exchanges. However, in an anarcho-capitalist system, no currency would have a state-backed monopoly. To those coming from an anarcho-syndicalist perspective, the use of money to facilitate the exchange of goods and services inherently leads to the accumulation of large quantities of capital in the hands of a few, and the subsequent enslavement of the vast majority of the population. In this view, if everything is available for sale in the free market, then eventually the means of production and survival all end up being owned by a handful of individuals. And those individuals inherently gain an inordinate degree of power in society as a result. Anarcho-syndicalists believe that the means of production and the results of the production should be shared by all. They view the profit motive as a negative force in society, one that often encourages people to work against their own best interest and the interest of society as a whole. Now, if we strip away all the derivative arguments from this debate, at the core, what we have is two competing forces: altruism and selfishness.
Okay, so that's a really stupid thing to say. The idea, I mean, it's sort of like a sort of, I don't know, maybe this is something your teacher tells you in history class in middle school or something, that socialism is about altruism and capitalism is about selfishness, right? I mean, this is just sort of like a cultural meme. It doesn't really have anything to do with the actual reality of these phenomena. Capitalism is not about so-called selfishness. Capitalists don't do what they do because they are selfish. It might seem that way with growing inequality and so forth, and so there's this sort of um, um, this sort of sense that was sort of coming out of, for instance, Occupy Wall Street, that capitalism encourages selfishness. But and you could maybe even see in 19th century socialist writing where they're talking about the horrors of the inequalities created by the Industrial Revolution and so forth. Um, but the point is that capitalists aren't doing what they're doing because they're selfish. Actually, it's nothing to do with selfishness. Being a capitalist can be very self-sacrificial, actually, because what the capitalists are doing is they're doing what they're doing um, to keep accumulating capital, right? To keep expanding their business, to keep expanding production, that kind of thing, right? Um, and they are slaves to that process, right? If a capitalist does something that's not conducive to that process, even if it's something selfish, right, something self-interested, that capitalist will be stands a very high chance of being annihilated. Especially, that chance is going to increase in proportion to the degree to which the capitalist engages in those sorts of activities that aren't conducive to profit making, right? So it's not about selfishness, right? It's about the um, endless cycle of investment for return, right? Continue making profits, right? Continue driving up GDP, etc., right? Continue investing, right? It's not selfishness. Um, then on the other side, this altruism thing, um, there's some extent to which you can call socialist ideas altruistic. There's this idea that um, we should have equality, right? There should be social control of the things that people need to survive, etc. But that's not, the main point, right? The main point is not, oh, we should be good Samaritans. We should help the old ladies across the street. That's not the main point. The main point is a point about the freedom of human beings, right? The point is that if human beings' needs are not met, their basic needs, right? And, maybe even over their basic needs, right? Because, this idea that it's okay if people get sustenance, but it's fine if they can't enjoy their lives, is something that socialists will also question. The basic idea is that if you do not have your needs met, you do not have control over your own life and circumstances, right? Which is the definition of what's called positive freedom in political philosophy, right? Um, so it's a point about human freedom, right? If I'm in poverty, I don't have control over my life, right? I don't get to do the things I want to do, right? I have to make sure that I can eat tomorrow, right? Um, you know, that's the point, right? It's a point about freedom. It's not a point about altruism.
Altruism being the tendency of individuals to act for the benefit of the group, and selfishness being the tendency of individuals to act primarily for their own benefit. Based on one's social conditioning, most people will view these as morally charged terms, with altruism being associated with goodness and selfishness being associated with evil. However, in order to actually view these forces for what they are, it is essential to suspend such judgments. Altruism and selfishness run deeper than morality. They are, in fact, prime movers in natural selection. That is to say, selfishness and altruism are the root motives of action for all species as they relate to the outside world.
Yeah, so I like when these people like make scientific claims that they provide no support for, right? Altruism and selfishness drive evolution and natural selection. Okay, what's the scientific support for that claim? Who knows? um, yeah, I mean,
As such, there is a genetic component to this debate. The law of natural selection merely states that traits that are
I don't think there is a law of natural. I mean, I could be wrong, but I don't think there is a law of natural selection. I don't think that's a thing. I think there's natural selection. I don't think there's like a law of natural selection, like there's a law of gravity. But
best able to ensure the reproduction of the individual will over time become more represented in a population. This is just common sense. If you survive long enough to have kids, then your genes survive. This obviously explains why selfishness is found in every species on the planet. In situations where resources are scarce, selfish individuals are more likely to pass on their genes than those who don't fight for such reasons.
why is any of this important, right? So I don't know why. Like this just seems to me to be like some nonsense evolutionary psychology, sociobiology stuff. Like why, like you know, why does this like why is that the explanation for altruism and selfishness? Why is that relevant to discussions about how to structure human societies? I mean, there's a distinction between cultural evolution and biological evolution made by anthropologists, right? That distinction is the distinction between the ways that human culture adapts to the environment and the ways that human biology adapts to the environment, right? And all he's talking about is the biology, as if that's, this sort of one explanation that we should all be interested in. I don't, why? you know, have you just like, I mean, this was before Jordan Peterson was a thing, but evolutionary psychology was a thing back then. Very controversial field because it's sort of a pseudoscience that manages to get academic interest. At least that's my view on it. But I mean, just like, why take this approach? Why is this approach compelling? Why is it the right approach? It doesn't seem like it is.
Resources. But what about altruism? Altruism is found in nature as well. We see this as mothers protect their young even at the risk of their own lives, bees which sacrifice themselves to attack invaders of the hive, and herd animals which sound the alarm of approaching predators, in the process attracting more attention to themselves. How do we reconcile altruism with the law of natural selection? You might find the answer surprising. Altruism in relation to the group is not a contradiction to selfishness. Those forms of altruism which have passed the test of natural selection are in fact disguised forms of selfishness. It's important to understand that when it comes to genetic traits, their success has as much to do with the way that they influence the overall behavior of the group as it does the individuals themselves. A hive of bees comprised of members with the instinct to attack all invaders without concern for the individual survival is much more likely to survive as a hive. The survival strategy of bees relies entirely on a group effort. Therefore, they pass down their genes on a hive level or not at all. Altruism in nature is selfishness at the level of a group. However, this equation only makes sense when the group in question is a fairly isolated gene pool. That is to say, when the species in question is a social animal with a clearly defined group membership. Essentially, what this means is that altruism is advantageous for animals who organize in packs and hives. Humans came into being as pack animals, and the word for a human pack is a tribe. At the level of a tribe, the gene pool is fairly self-contained. And in such a context, altruism presents a number of distinct advantages for the survival of the individual and the group. Pooling resources, uniting for common defense, and sharing responsibilities all give tribes a survival edge over humans operating as isolated individuals. Tribal configurations are thus very stable. This is evident in the fact that for the first 190,000 years of human history, tribes were the only human social structure on the planet. In tribes, ownership of property was often communal, and many common resources such as rivers and lakes were not considered property at all. They also existed without the state. Tribes are in fact the only long-lasting examples we have of stateless societies. If you follow this logic, what it indicates is that altruism and common ownership works for small autonomous societies. However, expecting people to be consistently altruistic towards people that they do not have a relationship with whom they have little contact, is unrealistic. It's also without historical precedent, and it goes against the forces of evolution. Altruism.
Yeah, I don't know that like the relative success, right, of tribal forms of social organization, right, doesn't give us a reason to think that that's sort of the only realistic form of social organization that can sort of preserve what's called altruism in this video, right? I mean, like, I mean, it just doesn't, it's just straightforwardly, just a non sequitur, right? I mean, like, human societies are not now mostly tribal, right? Even if they were for most of human history. Or, most of the time humans have existed, let's say. Um, but most human societies are not today tribal, and people are still altruistic. People still care about other people, right? That's why there are constant political struggles. If people were just selfish when they lived in non-tribal sort of larger scale societies, why would there be all of these constant social struggles? That doesn't really seem to make any sense. I mean, this just seems like really silly, really silly inference that's being made.
As a means of managing resources in sprawling industrial societies always ends up leaning heavily on state enforcement. But using violence to enforce your good intentions isn't altruism at all. However, our current system is not organized around small communities. We live in civilization. What we call civilization is the cultural and economic lineage that began about 10,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia.
Yeah, notice, so, there's a lot of hay that people make about the concept of civilization, right? Nationalist, the term was sort of originally, or the concept was sort of originally bandied about by nationalists, right, for political reasons. And interestingly, there's a sort of section of the, um, you know, anarchist movement, if you want to call it that, which is also obsessed with this concept. Okay, the reason that contemporary society is hierarchical and unequal and so forth is because it's a civilization. Um, you know, and of course, the term has some scholarly import as well. But um, notice it doesn't actually mean much. His description there was, well, it's a particular historical lineage. It's a type of society, and it's identified by this lineage. I mean, okay. I mean, all human societies have a common historical lineage. Why are you picking out that one? What's distinctive about it? Does it have distinctive social formations? He'll try to get into that a little bit later, but when people actually try to do this like taxonomy where they specify what civilization is, the best they can do is come up with a sort of list of features that don't really map to how the term is used. And my opinion of the term, it seems to me the term is, in scholarly hands, it's relatively meaningless, and that's an opinion that many scholars have as well. And in and as far as it has gone socioculturally, the word civilization is kind of just this, way of describing the group that one thinks should be dominant and in power, so that the subordination of others can be justified. I mean, it's not a particularly intelligible concept. It seems vacuous to me. But let's go ahead.
Began with the agricultural revolution, which gave birth to the division of labor, which created the demand for money as a unit of exchange, which led to the accumulation of capital and thus political power. And from that accumulation of wealth and power came standing armies, state enforcement. But using violence to enforce your good intentions isn't altruism at all. However, our current system is not organized around small communities. We live in civilization. What we call civilization is the cultural and economic lineage that began about 10,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia. It began with the agricultural revolution, which gave birth to the division of labor, which created the demand for money as a unit of exchange, which led to the
division of labor didn't create the demand for money as a unit of exchange. What created the demand of money, a demand for money as a unit of exchange, was actually the need for the state to mobilize resources, to mobilize militaries, for example. So it had nothing to do with the division of labor. That's sort of a myth that you get from Adam Smith, that anthropologists have been sort of explicit that there isn't any empirical support for it, despite the fact that it still gets repeated in economics textbooks.
The accumulation of capital and thus political power. And from that accumulation began with the agricultural revolution, which gave birth to the division of labor, which created the demand for money as a unit of exchange, which led to the accumulation of capital and thus political power.
Okay, the existence of money is not what, like, it's not like, okay, you had money, then you had capital accumulation, then you had political power. That's not what happened. Right? I mean, that can't have been what happened, because political power far predates societies where capital accumulation was the sort of main premise of productive activity, right? That's just not. I mean, it's just not. This is just not what happened, right? I mean,
and from that accumulation of wealth and power came standing armies, and thereby the state. Now, this picture.
I mean, yeah, it's correct that the military comes from the state. That's true. Everything else was wrong.
Presents an uncomfortable challenge to both sides of the thing, which led to the accumulation of capital and thus political power. And from that accumulation of wealth and power came standing armies, and thereby the state. Now, this picture presents an uncomfortable challenge to both sides of this question of communal ownership versus capitalism, altruism versus selfishness, and all the ideological derivatives that come from this. It presents a and from that accumulation of wealth and power came standing armies and thereby the state. Now, this picture presents an uncomfortable challenge to both sides of this question of communal ownership versus capitalism, altruism versus selfishness, and all the and thereby the state. Now, this picture presents an uncomfortable challenge to both sides of this question of communal ownership versus capitalism, altruism versus selfishness, and all the ideological derivatives that come from this. It presents a problem because it indicates that both sides may hit a wall if they attempt to remove state coercion without taking into account the actual size of the society in question. The reality of the matter is that the debate over capitalism is a false dichotomy. If you truly want to remove state coercion from
Okay, well, debates aren't dichotomies, so a false dichotomy is when you're given two options that aren't exhaustive, right? A debate is not two options, you know. I don't. Okay, I mean, people just use these terms like, you know, they just brandish them about without knowing what they mean.
the picture, society will need to be organized into very small, highly autonomous, attempt to remove state coercion without taking capitalism, altruism versus selfishness, and all the ideological derivatives that come from this. It presents a problem because it indicates that both sides may hit a wall if they attempt to remove state coercion without taking into account the actual size of the society in question. The reality of the matter is that the debate over capitalism is a false dichotomy. If you truly want to remove state coercion from the picture, society will need to be organized into very small, highly autonomous units of sovereignty. The reason
Why? I mean, first of all, if you have units of sovereignty, the state is still in the picture, right? Sovereignty is, you know, something that states possess, right? It's not something that anything else possesses, right? So that's a misuse of that word. But like, why? Like, what's the argument for this? That, you know, okay, most stateless societies have been tribal societies. So if there's to be a stateless society, you need, you know, something akin to tribal societies in scale. I mean, that what what that's just not, like, you know, a good bit of reasoning, right? I mean, there's nothing there that shows us why there can't be larger scale societies that don't have the state, right? I mean, you know, I mean, the if you actually sort of investigate how this stuff happened, um it's not that, like, you know, the fact that, you know, there's like a one-to-one correlation between a larger scale society and the existence of the state, such that there's a really good causal explanation that the existence of larger scale societies will entail the existence of a state. I mean, that's just not, there just isn't anything like that in the anthropological record. The reason that larger scale societies happened to be, you know, tend to be state societies with a state is because larger scale societies have historically tended to be class societies, and you basically need the state to maintain certain class divisions. And the reason that larger scale societies tended to be class societies um, was not anything to do with their size, but because the sort of move from one to the other, you know, coincided with the formation of class societies as a result of um, you know, um, increase in population and you know, relative to the scarcity of resources. So, you know, I mean, it has nothing to do with, you know, straightforwardly with how many people live in a society. I mean, it just doesn't. Um, you know, so like, this is just like really bad simplistic anthropology. I mean, it's kind of the same anthropology that like primitivists do, right? And they're sort of notoriously bad with anthropology, despite the fact that, you know, that's the one thing they want to stake their case on.
for this is simple. If you remove the state from the equation, pure free market organization and pure communal organization both would depend on deep and long lasting human relationships to work. Neither could just be applied in our current system with the nuclear family as the model, with sprawling urban areas, institutionalized education.
Oh yes, you're right. You know, Communism can't be applied in capitalism. Thank you for that contribution.
And a politically disengaged public. Essentially, both sides need to focus on local autonomy. You found this video to
Well, I mean, no. So, the reason that, at least socialists aren't interested in that, right? I mean, they may be interested in it to some degree, but that isn't like a primary goal of socialists, right? Is that socialists are internationalists, right? Socialists want the liberation of humanity, and they're aware of how, restrictive territorial political entities are used to perpetuate discrimination, inequality, and domination, e.g., the nation state, right? So, no, socialists should not be concerned with that primarily. I mean, why? No. But anyway, so we don't need to hear him promote his channel. Yeah, so that's the stream for today. It was a Patreon request. You can too request content if you're a patron. And yeah, the next video should be the latest entry in the series Explicating World Systems Analysis. So, stay tuned for that. And yeah, I'll see you later.